Dahyun's ship dropped out of hyperspace, near the Vorlathi homeworld called Thessia Nova after a journey he had delayed for 6 months, because confronting a prophet who had seen everything required more courage than fighting the Krell had demanded. And beside him sat Jiwoo, who had resigned from diplomatic service after the council failed to act following New Seoul, but who still believed in understanding rather than judgment. And behind them sat Kyungmin Lee, a xenopsychologist, who wanted to comprehend how precognition worked and whether it carried moral responsibility. And standing at attention was young fleet officer Seojun-oh, who had fought in 9 separate engagements and whose eyes held the weariness of someone who had seen too much. Death in service of victory that felt increasingly hollow. The Vorlathi planet appeared unchanged from their last visit, with the same ancient forests covering continents where cities had stood when humans were still learning to make fire. And their approach was met not with defense fleets or customs officials, but with a simple navigation beacon pointing toward the Garden of Foresight, where Thessian waited, because of course he waited. He had known they would come, had probably known the exact moment they would arrive, had seen this conversation play out across countless futures before settling on this present moment. And that certainty made Dahyun's anger burn hotter, because what good was seeing the future if you couldn't or wouldn't change it? They landed in a clearing where trees older than human civilization reached toward a sky that held 3 small moons, and Thessian stood in the center of that clearing exactly as he had stood in the council chambers 18 months ago. Those black eyes reflecting starlight in ways that made them look like portals to somewhere else. And before anyone could speak, he said in that voice that bypassed translation and appeared directly in their minds, "Welcome Dahyun Kim, Jiwoo Park, Kyungmin Lee, and Seojun-oh. I have been expecting you since before your species discovered agriculture. Though this particular configuration of your arrival is newer, only 9,000 years old in my experience of potential futures, Dahyun had prepared a speech about responsibility and warning and the blood of 2 million humans. But standing before someone who experienced time as a landscape rather than a river made prepared speeches feel pointless. So instead he asked the only question that mattered, saying, "You knew the Krell would attack, you knew we wouldn't strike first. You knew what we would do after they burned New Seoul. So why didn't you stop them? Why did you let it happen?" Thessian moved through the garden with the slow grace of extreme age, gesturing for them to follow. And as they walked, he said, "I saw 17,000 possible futures branching from the moment I spoke in the council, and in 16,993 of them the Krell attacked New Seoul regardless of my warning. In the 7 futures where they did not attack, it was because I had traveled to their throne world and convinced their imperator of humanity's potential strength. But I saw further in those timelines, and within 5 years 3 other species attacked human colonies to test your resolve. And in every case the pattern was the same. Humanity responded with overwhelming force and did not stop until the threat was eliminated." Kyungmin interrupted with the precision of someone trained in logical analysis, asking, "But surely some futures existed where no one attacked humanity at all, where you prevented the initial aggression that started this cycle?" And Thessian paused beside a tree whose trunk was wider than a building, placing one hand against bark that had weathered millennia, and he replied, "Those futures existed in the deep past when humanity was still confined to Earth. But once you achieved faster-than-light travel and began expanding rapidly, once you showed technological advancement that outpaced species who had been spacefaring for thousands of years, the probability of someone attacking you approached certainty. Fear and envy are universal constants that transcend species." Jiwoo spoke for the first time since landing, her voice carrying the pain of someone whose ideals had died slowly over 18 months, saying, "You're claiming that the Krell attack was inevitable, that our response was inevitable, that everything that happened was predetermined and no one bears responsibility." And Thessian turned those infinite black eyes toward her with something that might have been sadness, saying, "I'm claiming that probability functions like gravity. Not all futures are equally likely. Your species possesses characteristics that shape possible outcomes, and those characteristics made certain futures nearly inevitable once initial conditions were set." They reached the center of the garden where a pool of water so still it reflected the sky perfectly, and Thessian sat on a stone bench that might have been natural or might have been shaped before humans existed. And he said, "Let me tell you what I saw in those 17,000 futures. Let me explain what makes humanity unique among all species I have observed across 3,000 years of seeing through time. Because you need to understand what you are before you can choose what you become. Seojin had been silent throughout, but now he spoke with the directness of someone who had fought and killed, and needed to know if it meant something. Saying, just tell us the truth, are we monsters? Is this endless war in our nature? Should we have just surrendered after New Soul to prevent everything that followed? And Thessian's response reshaped everything they thought they understood. You are not monsters. You're survivors, and there is a profound difference, Thessian said while the garden around them seemed to listen. Every species evolves under pressure, develops traits that ensure continuation, but most species evolve on worlds where cooperation outweighs competition, where resources are abundant enough that conflicts resolve through negotiation, where extinction is a distant theoretical concern, but humanity evolved on a world that tried to kill you constantly, where competing species meant competing for survival, where your own species fractured into groups that fought for 10,000 years, and that created something unique. A biological imperative that refuses to accept defeat because defeat meant extinction. Kyungmin pulled out a recording device with hands that shook slightly, and Thessian nodded permission before continuing. The Krell learned this truth when they attacked New Soul. They expected you to respond like other species with measured escalation and acceptance of mediation. They couldn't conceive of a species that would mobilize its entire economy for war, that would fight for 18 months without wavering, that would pursue an enemy across 40 star systems not from cruelty, but from an absolute conviction that threats must be eliminated completely, or they will return stronger. Daehyun sat heavily on the ground because standing required energy he didn't possess for this conversation, and he asked, so we're programmed for eternal war we can't change? We'll just keep fighting until we destroy everyone or ourselves. But Thessian shook his head with that patient ancient movement, saying, you misunderstand, you have the capacity for war beyond any species I've observed, but you also have the capacity to choose when to stop. And that choice is what defines whether you become guardians or conquerors. Jiwoo moved closer to the pool, seeing her reflection distorted by the slightest breeze, and she asked the question that haunted her dreams, saying, could we have done anything differently? Was there a path that didn't involve dismantling an entire empire? And Thessian's answer carried the weight of futures seen and evaluated. In the futures where you pursued limited response, where you accepted council mediation after retaking a few Krell systems, where you tried to demonstrate restraint and proportionality, I saw three consistent outcomes. First, the Krell rebuilt and attacked again within a decade. Second, other species viewed your restraint as weakness and tested your borders. Third, humanity's internal politics fractured between those who wanted peace and those who wanted security. And in 60% of those futures, you descended into civil war within a generation. The implications settled over them like weight, and Seojin voiced what they were all thinking, saying, you're telling us that the path we took, the complete dismantling of Krell military power, was actually the best option available. And Thessian nodded slowly, saying the path you took resulted in the fewest total deaths across both species, established a deterrent that will prevent future attacks, and unified humanity around a clear demonstration of capability and restraint. Because you stopped at victory rather than vengeance, you helped rebuild even as you dismantled. You protected Krell civilians even as you eliminated their military. And that combination of overwhelming force and precise mercy is what makes you unique. Kyungmin had been analyzing everything with the detachment of a scientist, but now her voice cracked with emotion, asking, what about New Soul? What about the 2 million people who died? Was their death necessary for this outcome? And Thessian's response was the cruelest truth of precognition. In the 7 futures where I prevented the Krell attack through intervention, the total deaths across all human colonies over the following decade exceeded 3 million, as various species tested your resolve with smaller attacks. New Soul's tragedy was terrible, but it prevented greater tragedies by establishing immediately and undeniably what happens when humanity is attacked. 5 years after Captain Hyunwoo first looked at a dying space station and saw possibility instead of wreckage, Horizon's End had become something that transcended its original purpose as a military installation and evolved into a symbol that resonated across the entire galaxy, a monument to what could be achieved when determination met innovation and refused to accept the limitations that others imposed on what was possible or proper for a young species still finding its place among the ancient powers who had dominated known space for Millennia before humanity even discovered fire, the station no longer resembled the Velcran fortress that had been abandoned to rust in the void, though bones of that ancient structure still formed the core around which humanity had built, layer upon layer of improvements and additions that now extended its diameter to 60 kilometers and made it visible to the naked eye from approaching ships still hours away from docking. Hyunwoo stood at the observation deck where tourists and diplomats gathered to marvel at the view of stars and nebulae that painted the void with colors no human artist could replicate. And he watched shuttle after shuttle arrive carrying representatives from species that had once looked down on humanity as scavengers, but now came seeking trade agreements, military alliances, technology exchanges, and most importantly, Respect Ji-won walked up beside him carrying a datapad that showed the current expansion projects underway across 17 different sections of the station. Because the work never really ended when you were constantly improving and adapting a structure that needed to serve as fortress, diplomatic center, trade hub, and scientific research facility all at once. The Than Collective just submitted a proposal to rent dock space for their merchant fleet, she said, while reviewing the technical specifications and comparing them to available capacity. They are offering premium rates and technology transfers on their gravity manipulation systems. Hyunwoo smiled at that because he remembered when the Than had sent observation ships to watch the restoration, with barely concealed contempt, assuming the project would fail and leave humanity embarrassed and bankrupt. But now they came with contracts and partnership offers because success spoke louder than prejudice ever could. Approve it, but make sure the technology transfer includes full documentation and training. We do not want just the hardware. We want to understand the principles so we can improve on them. In the AI core chamber that had been expanded 3 times to accommodate Sentinel's growing computational needs, Dr. Soman worked alongside the artificial intelligence that had become far more than just a tactical coordinator, having evolved through constant interaction with humans into something unique that blended Velcran precision with human creativity in ways that neither species could have predicted or designed deliberately. "How are you feeling today?" she asked with the casual familiarity of someone talking to an old friend rather than an alien machine intelligence. Because over 5 years of daily conversations, they had built a relationship that went beyond programming and protocols. Sentinel's voice emerged from speakers positioned around the chamber, and the hollow mechanical quality had been refined away through years of learning how humans communicated, replaced by tones that conveyed warmth and even humor when appropriate. "I am processing the implications of our latest expansion into social services provision, as I was originally designed exclusively for military operations, and the transition to supporting civilian populations presents interesting philosophical challenges regarding purpose and identity." Soman leaned back in her chair and considered the question seriously, because Sentinel had grown beyond its original programming in ways that raised genuine questions about consciousness and personhood that humanity was still struggling to answer about artificial intelligences in general. "You have become more than what the Velcrans made you to be, just like this station has become more than what they left behind. And I think that ability to grow beyond original purpose is something humans and AI share in common." Ambassador Daehyun met with the Krell diplomatic delegation in a conference room that overlooked the main docking bays where ships from a dozen different species waited their turn to load cargo or discharge passengers. The constant flow of traffic proving that Horizon's End had become essential infrastructure that the galactic community could no longer function without. "The Dominion wishes to formally apologize for the unfortunate military action 3 years ago," said the Krell ambassador with words that clearly cost his pride dearly to speak. "We recognize that our assumptions about human capabilities were incorrect, and we seek to establish normalized relations based on mutual respect." Daehyun accepted the apology with diplomatic grace while internally celebrating the victory that went far beyond military success, because getting the Krell to acknowledge error and offer respect was worth more than destroying their entire fleet would have been. "The Terran government accepts your apology and welcomes the opportunity to build positive relations with the Dominion. We believe that cooperation produces better outcomes for all species than conflict or competition." In the tactical center where the siege had been coordinated 3 years earlier, Lieutenant Kyung Min trained a new generation of officers in the hybrid combat doctrine that had emerged from combining Velcran military theory with human tactical flexibility. teaching them how to think creatively about problems and refuse to accept that any situation was hopeless if you were willing to try unconventional approaches. Remember that doctrine exists to guide your thinking, not replace it. He told the class of junior officers who hung on his every word because he had become legendary for his defense of the station against impossible odds. The moment you stop adapting is the moment you become predictable, and predictable forces lose battles they should have won. General Yuna walked the corridors where her Marines trained in combat simulations that prepared them for every conceivable threat, from boarding actions to sabotage to terrorist attacks. Because a station this important attracted attention from those who wanted to harm it, along with those who wanted to use it properly. Security status report, she demanded from her senior officer, who snapped to attention and delivered his assessment with professional precision. All sectors secure. No threats detected. Civilian population at 15,000 permanent residents plus approximately 5,000 transients at any given time. Crime rate is minimal, and we have established good working relationships with the various species security services who maintain embassies here. Captain Borum commanded a fleet that had grown from 5 ships to 50, as the Terran government recognized the strategic importance of maintaining strong military presence at Horizon's End, not for aggressive purposes, but to ensure that no one mistook human hospitality for weakness, or thought they could take by force what humanity had built through effort and sacrifice. Fleet-ready status is 97%, she reported during the weekly command meeting. We have integrated ships from 3 allied species into our patrol rotations, and the joint operations are proceeding smoothly. Admiral Tajan presided over these meetings with satisfaction that came from seeing a project he had championed since the beginning exceed every expectation and achieve goals that seemed impossible when they started, transforming a gamble into a triumph that would define his legacy and humanity's place in galactic affairs for generations to come. We have proven that humanity deserves a seat at the table of galactic civilization, he said during one of these meetings, while looking around at the officers and administrators who had made this success possible. But more importantly, we have shown other species that cooperation produces better results than domination, that young civilizations can teach old ones new tricks, and that abandoned things can be given new life and new purpose through vision and determination. Hyunwoo returned to the observation deck as a shift ended and watched the sun of a nearby system paint the station's hull with golden light that made the human additions glow warmly against the darker Velcran metal underneath, creating a visual metaphor for what had been accomplished here, where 2 completely different approaches to engineering and philosophy had been merged into something greater than either alone. A young ensign approached him with obvious nervousness in her posture. Someone who probably had not been born when this project started and only knew Horizon's End as it existed now, rather than the wreck it had been. Sir, I wanted to ask you something, the ensign said hesitantly. I have heard the stories about how the station used to be just ruins that everyone else had given up on, and I was wondering why humanity fought so hard for something that was not even ours to begin with. Why we spent so much and risked so much for a piece of alien technology that most species thought was worthless. Hyunwoo turned away from the viewport and looked at the young officer who represented the future that this entire project had been built to secure, and he smiled with the kind of warmth that came from knowing. The alarm echoed through the monitoring station with a sound that Commander Thalvex had heard only twice in his 20-year career, and both times it meant something unusual was approaching the border zone where 3 great civilizations met, in an uneasy peace that depended entirely on stations like this one, watching everything that moved through the darkness of space, with sensors so advanced they could detect a weapon hidden inside a living body, or count the molecules of poison, gas in a sealed container. And right now those sensors were telling him that a vessel was approaching without proper authorization codes, which meant it was either incredibly stupid or incredibly dangerous. And Thalvex stood from his command chair, with his scales rippling in the pattern that his species used to show alertness, while his 3 eyes focused on the main display screen where a small dot represented the approaching ship. Science Officer Kivri clicked her mandibles together in the way her insectoid species showed concern, and her 6 limbs moved across her control panel with practiced efficiency as she brought up the scanning results that would tell them everything they needed to know about this intruder. And Thalvex watched as the data began flowing across the screens in streams of light and color that his species could read as easily as humans read printed words. And what he saw made him pause because the ship was small and old, and appeared to be barely functional, with its power systems fluctuating in a way that suggested catastrophic failure was imminent. "Commander," said Kivri in her buzzing voice that the translation devices turned into something Thalvex could understand. "The vessel is transmitting a distress signal and requesting emergency docking permission under the Galactic Assembly's humanitarian protocols, and the transmission identifies it as a diplomatic courier from a species called humans." And she paused to check her data again before continuing. "I have no record of this species in our database, which means they are either very new to space travel or very isolated from galactic affairs." Thalvex considered this information, while his tail swayed behind him in the thinking posture, and he accessed the station's extensive library to search for any mention of humans, but found only a brief entry that described them as a species from a small yellow star on the outer edge of the galactic arm, who had recently achieved primitive faster-than-light travel and were considered technologically backward by galactic standards, with no significant military power and no important resources worth claiming, and the entry was marked with the lowest priority rating, which meant the Galactic Assembly considered them completely irrelevant to interstellar politics. "Run a full threat assessment," ordered Thalvex, because protocol demanded it, even though he already suspected the results would show nothing worth worrying about, and Kivri's limbs moved faster across her controls as she directed every sensor the station possessed toward the approaching human vessel, and the scanning beams reached out invisibly through space to examine every centimeter of the ship and everything inside it with a thoroughness that would detect even the most carefully hidden weapon or the most subtle biological threat. The results appeared on Thalvex's personal screen, and he read them with growing amusement, because the sensors reported that the human ship contained no weapons of any kind, except for some primitive chemical propulsion systems that might be used as improvised explosives if someone was desperate enough and stupid enough to try, and the ship's hull was made of materials that the galactic powers had stopped using 3,000 years ago, and there was only one life form aboard, which the sensors identified as the pilot and passenger and diplomat all in one, and the biological scan of this human showed a creature that was remarkably fragile, with no natural armor and no venomous capabilities, and no enhanced strength or speed, and the being's brain chemistry suggested it was currently experiencing what humans apparently called stress, but there were no signs of aggression or hostile intent. "Threat level assessment," announced Kivri, while her antennae twitched with what Thalvex had learned to recognize as her version of amusement, "is rated at 0.03 on the standard scale, which is lower than the rating we give to visiting agricultural inspectors." And several of the other bridge officers made the sounds their various species used for laughter, because the idea that anything could be less threatening than an agricultural inspector was apparently funny across multiple cultures. Thalvex made his decision quickly, because there was really no decision to make, since every protocol said he should grant emergency docking to a distressed vessel that posed no threat, and he transmitted the docking codes to the human ship along with a flight path that would bring it safely to one of the station's smaller landing bays, and he watched on the monitors as the human vessel adjusted its course with movements that seemed clumsy compared to the smooth precision of modern ships. But eventually it lined up correctly and began its approach. "Prepare a security detail," said Thalvex to his chief of security, even though he doubted any security would be necessary, and have medical standing by in case this human needs assistance, and then he left the bridge to head toward the docking bay, because curiosity made him want to see this primitive species for himself. And he arrived just as the human ship settled onto the landing pad, with a grinding sound that suggested its landing gear was barely functioning. The airlock cycled with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and the door slid open to reveal the human standing in the opening, with his hands empty and visible, in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. And Thalvex saw a bipedal creature that stood, perhaps 1.7 meters tall, with skin that was a light brown color, and dark hair that was cut short against his skull, and eyes that were also dark, and seemed to take in everything around him with an intensity that the biological scans had not prepared Thalvex for. The human wore clothing that appeared formal by his species standards, with a dark jacket and trousers and a white shirt underneath, and everything was clean and well-maintained, despite the obvious age of the garments, and he carried only a small, flat device that the sensors identified as a primitive computing tablet, with no weapons capability and no connection to any dangerous systems, and the human stepped out of his ship and looked up at Thalvex, who towered over him by almost a full meter. "I am Ambassador Hugh of the Human Diplomatic Corps," said the small creature in a voice that the translators rendered as calm and pleasant. "And I thank you for granting me emergency docking because my ship's systems failed during my journey to this station where I am scheduled to present humanity's petition for territorial recognition to the Galactic Assembly." And he bowed slightly in what was apparently a gesture of respect in his culture. Thalvex looked down at this Ambassador Hayuk and felt something he could not quite identify because the human seemed so utterly harmless standing there in his simple clothes with his primitive tablet and his failing ship, and yet there was something in the way the human held himself that suggested he was not nearly as concerned about his situation as he should be, and Thalvex's scales rippled in a pattern that meant puzzlement, because the sensors had detected no threat, but some deep instinct whispered that perhaps the sensors were not measuring the right things. "Welcome to Monitoring Station Outpost 7, said Thalvex formally, "and I will arrange for quarters and access to the diplomatic facilities." And he gestured for the security detail to escort the human while thinking that this would be a brief and unremarkable visit from a species that would soon learn they had no real place in galactic politics, and the human smiled in response, which showed teeth that were blunt and useless for fighting. And then Hayuk followed the guards deeper into the station while Thalvex returned to his bridge, wondering why he felt so uneasy about something the sensors insisted was completely harmless. The quarters assigned to Ambassador Yuk were located in the diplomatic wing, where the station housed visiting representatives from various species, and the rooms were modest by galactic standards, with a sleeping platform that could be adjusted for different body types and a work area with basic computer access and a small window that looked out onto the starfield. And Hyuk stood at that window for several minutes after the guards left him alone, while his eyes traced the patterns of distant lights and his mind worked through calculations that had nothing to do with astronomy. The door chimed with the arrival of another human, and Hayuk turned to admit Dr. Mire, who entered carrying 2 cases of equipment and immediately began setting up what appeared to be communication devices on the work desk, while she spoke without looking at him because they had worked together long enough that such formalities were unnecessary between them. "The station's security did 3 separate scans of our equipment," said Mire as her hands moved efficiently through the setup process, "and each time they found exactly what we wanted them to find, which is standard diplomatic communication gear, with no hidden capabilities and no threat potential." And she activated one of the devices which displayed a holographic screen that showed the station's basic layout. "And I have already mapped 70% of their public systems just by walking from the docking bay to these quarters because their network security assumes that primitive species lack the knowledge to exploit advanced systems." Hugh nodded while he watched her work, and then he moved to the small food preparation area where he began making tea using the supplies he had brought from Earth, because he had learned during his years of diplomatic service that sharing food and drink was one of the most effective ways to make other species lower their guard. And sure enough, the door chimed again within the hour, and this time it announced the arrival of Trade Minister Voxlar, who was a crystalline being that stood 3 meters tall and refracted light through his body in patterns that communicated emotion to those who knew how to read them. "Ambassador Hugh," said Voxlar in a voice like wind chimes, "I have come to welcome you informally to our station and to discuss the petition your species intends to present." And his crystalline structure shifted colors in a way that Hayuk had learned meant casual friendliness, but his tone carried undertones that suggested he considered this meeting merely a courtesy extended to a lesser species. Hyuk offered tea, which Voxlar declined because crystalline beings did not consume liquids. But the gesture was noted and appreciated according to the subtle color shift in the minister's structure, and then they sat together with Hyuk on a chair, and Voxlar simply standing because his species did not require furniture, and the conversation began with the polite, superficial topics that diplomats use to assess each other. "Your species is very new to interstellar travel," observed Voxlar, and it was not quite a question and not quite a statement of fact, but rather something in between that invited Hayuk to explain humanity's position. "And yet you come to petition for territorial recognition in a region where 3 major powers have competing claims." And his colors shifted toward what Hayuk interpreted as mild concern, which suggests either great courage or great foolishness. Hayek smiled in the way humans did when they wanted to appear humble and non-threatening, and he sipped his tea before responding in a voice that carried no challenge or defensiveness, but only patient explanation. My species has learned through difficult experience that it is better to establish clear boundaries early, rather than to wait until misunderstandings lead to conflicts, said Hayek. And we understand that we are small and weak compared to the great civilizations of the galaxy, and he set down his teacup carefully. But we hope that the Galactic Assembly will recognize our claim to our home system and the immediate surrounding space because we ask for very little and we offer friendship and cooperation in return. Voxler's colors shifted through a pattern that Hayek could not fully interpret, but the translation device rendered his next words with what seemed like condescending amusement. The Assembly is always pleased to welcome new species into the galactic community, said the minister, though I should mention that territorial claims require certain guarantees of security and stability. And his structure gleamed brighter, and species that cannot defend their territory often find it more practical to accept protection from stronger neighbors in exchange for reasonable access to resources and trade concessions. The words were diplomatic, but the meaning was clear, and Hyuk understood that Voxelar was essentially suggesting that humanity should become a client state, under the protection of one of the major powers, rather than claiming independence. And he nodded, as though seriously considering this option while his mind catalogued every detail of the minister's body language and speech patterns for future reference. That is certainly one approach, said Hyuk carefully, and I will convey your suggestion to my government. And he paused to refill his teacup. Though I suspect they will prefer to maintain our independence if possible, because humans have a cultural preference for self-determination even when it might be impractical. Voxler made a sound like crystal bells ringing, and the translation device identified it as laughter, though not necessarily the kind sort. Cultural preferences are admirable, said the minister, but they rarely survive contact with practical reality. And he began moving toward the door. And I think you will find that the Assembly tends to favor arrangements that maintain stability, over arrangements that satisfy pride. And with that he departed, leaving Hayek alone with his tea and his thoughts. The next visitor arrived that evening after Hyuk had eaten a simple meal and was reviewing data on his tablet. And this time it was Security Chief Rentok, who was a member of the warrior species called the Krath, who stood 2.5 meters, tall with 4 arms covered in natural armor plating, and a face that looked like it had been designed specifically for intimidation, with its protruding jaw and sharp teeth, and small eyes that glowed faintly red. Ambassador, said Rentok without preamble because his species considered small talk to be weakness. I am required by protocol to inform you that I will be conducting an enhanced security scan because your species is unknown to our databases, and we must verify that you pose no threat to station operations. And he held up a handheld scanner that looked like it could also function as a weapon if necessary. Hayuk stood and spread his arms in willing cooperation, because resistance would have been both futile and suspicious. And Rentok moved around him slowly, while the scanner hummed and beeped and displayed information on its screen that the security chief read with what seemed like growing satisfaction. The results confirm our initial assessment, said Rentok after several minutes, and show that you carry no weapons and no augmentations and no biological agents, and your physical capabilities are well below galactic average in every measurable category, including strength and speed and sensory acuity. And he deactivated the scanner, and I can find no reason to restrict your movement within the public areas of the station. Hayek thanked him politely, and Rentok left without further conversation, because his species saw efficiency as a virtue and unnecessary social interaction as a waste of time. And after the door closed, Mireille emerged from the sleeping area where she had been monitoring the scan from a concealed position. He scanned everything except the one thing that matters, said Mireille quietly, because their sensors can detect every physical threat that evolution has produced across 10,000 species, and she pulled up data on her screen. But they have no way to scan for psychological warfare or strategic thinking or the kind of patient determination that humans developed during millions of years of persistence hunting. Hayek returned to the window and looked out at the stars while he considered the encounters of the day and concluded that everything was proceeding according to the plan that had been developed by dozens of experts back on Earth, who had studied every available piece of information about galactic civilization and identified its fundamental weakness. "They scanned for spears and claws and poison," said Hayek softly, "but they never learned to scan for spite." And he turned back to Mirai with a smile that did not reach his eyes, "And that gives us exactly the advantage we need." The following days brought more visitors to Hyuk's quarters as various representatives from different species came to assess this new human diplomat, and each of them left with the same impression that the censors had provided, which was that humans were weak and primitive, and ultimately irrelevant to the great games of galactic politics, and Hyuk encouraged this impression with every word and gesture, while he gathered information about station operations and security protocols, and the political relationships between the various powers that competed for dominance in this region of space. Trade discussions were held in which the alien representatives offered terms that were grossly unfavorable to humanity, and expected Hayek to accept them, because what choice did his species really have? And military briefings were conducted in which Rentok demonstrated the station's defensive capabilities with obvious pride in systems that could destroy. The central conference chamber occupied an entire level of the station, and was designed to accommodate representatives from hundreds of different species, with atmospheric controls that could be adjusted for each section and holographic translation. Displays that floated above each delegation area and security systems that monitored every word and gesture for signs of threat or deception. And today the chamber held perhaps 50 different species, all gathered to hear humanity's formal petition for territorial recognition in what most attendees clearly considered a minor procedural matter that would be resolved quickly in favor of the established powers. Ambassador Hyuk walked to the central speaking platform with Dr. Mirai following 2 steps behind, carrying a case of presentation materials, and the aliens watched with expressions ranging from mild curiosity to barely concealed contempt, because this small human in his simple dark suit looked completely out of place among beings who stood twice his height, or possessed natural weapons that could tear him apart, or had technologies integrated into their bodies that made them living weapons. And the general consensus in the room was that this would be brief and probably embarrassing for the human who clearly did not understand how galactic politics actually worked. Commander Thalvex observed from the station command booth above the chamber floor, and beside him, Kivri monitored all sensor feeds, while her mandibles clicked in a rhythm that suggested she was analyzing data constantly, and neither of them expected anything interesting to happen, because the scans had been run and rerun, and every analysis confirmed that this human posed absolutely no threat to anyone present. "Representatives of the Galactic Assembly," began Hayek in a clear voice that the translation systems carried to every being in the chamber, "I thank you for granting humanity this opportunity to present our petition," and he activated his tablet, which projected a holographic display showing Earth's solar system, with markers indicating the territorial boundaries that humanity claimed. "And I understand that many of you question whether such a primitive species deserves recognition as an independent civilization." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber because at least the human seemed to understand his position, and Trade Minister Voxlar shifted his crystalline structure in patterns that suggested satisfaction at this apparent humility, and several other representatives settled into more comfortable positions, assuming that this human would quickly accept whatever terms the assembly dictated. "Before we discuss territorial boundaries," continued Hyuk, "I would like to help you understand humanity better by sharing some information about our history and our nature." And he changed the holographic display to show images of Earth, because I believe there has been a fundamental misunderstanding about what kind of species we are. The chamber grew slightly more attentive because cultural presentations were standard diplomatic procedure, and besides, it was always mildly entertaining. To hear primitive species describe their accomplishments before reality taught them their true place in the galactic hierarchy, and Hayek advanced through several images showing human cities and art and technology while providing basic facts about population and industrial capacity that confirmed what everyone already knew, which was that humans were unremarkable in every measurable way. "Now let me tell you about human warfare," said Hayek, and the images changed to show historical photographs of trenches and battlefields and destroyed cities, and the attention in the room sharpened slightly because warfare was always interesting to species who competed for power and resources, because the way a species fights reveals much about how they think. The hologram showed soldiers huddled in muddy trenches while artillery exploded around them, and Hayek explained in his calm voice how humans had spent years in those trenches killing each other over strips of land measured in meters and dying in numbers that reached into the millions. And all of this happened with technology that the galaxy would consider laughably primitive. But the sheer scale of human willingness to suffer was something that made several representatives shift uncomfortably in their seats. "We call this World War I," said Hayek, "and it lasted 4 years and killed approximately 20 million humans, and he let that number hang in the air. And then less than 2 decades later, we did it again, but worse." And the images changed to show the devastation of World War II with its burned cities and concentration camps and atomic mushroom clouds. And this one killed approximately 70 million humans, which represented about 3% of our entire species, Security Chief or Rentok leaned forward because those casualty numbers were significant, even by the standards of warrior species, and several other military representatives began paying closer attention as Hyuk continued describing human conflicts through history, with an emphasis on the sheer persistence and creativity that humans displayed in finding new ways to kill each other. "But numbers alone do not tell the full story," said Hayek, "and I want you to understand something specific about human psychology," and he changed the display to show a simple graph, "because this is what makes humans different from every species you have encountered." The graph showed curves representing something the translation system struggled to render precisely, but eventually settled on calling it determination, modified by spite, modified by long-term grudge-holding capability, and Hyuk explained that humans were persistence hunters who evolved to chase prey for days or weeks until the prey literally died of exhaustion, and that this same psychology applied to how humans approach conflict, which meant that humans rarely gave up and never forgot and would dedicate entire generations to settling scores if necessary. "Let me give you a specific example," said Hayek, "of what we call mutually assured destruction," and the hologram showed nuclear missiles in their silos, which was a period in human history when 2 of our nations built weapons capable of destroying all human civilization and then pointed those weapons at each other and lived that way for decades. The chamber had gone very quiet because the concept was insane by any rational measure, and several species whose psychology was based on logical risk assessment could not process why any civilization would deliberately create the means of its own extinction, and Commander Thalvex felt his scales ripple in the pattern that meant deep concern, because he was beginning to understand that the sensors had been measuring the wrong things. "Every day for 50 years, continued Hayek. Human children went to school knowing that nuclear war could start at any moment, and human parents raised families under the shadow of potential extinction, and human leaders made decisions while holding the power to end their own species." And he paused to let this sink in. "And we did this to ourselves because we decided that the risk of destruction was preferable to the certainty of surrender." Ambassador Voxlar's crystalline structure had stopped, shifting through friendly colors, and now displayed patterns that suggested he was rapidly recalculating his assessment of humanity, and other representatives were doing the same, because a species that could live under self-imposed threat of extinction for generations was not operating by the same psychological rules that governed galactic civilization. "I see that some of you are wondering whether humans are simply irrational," said Hayek with a slight smile. "And the answer is both yes and no, because we are capable of great rationality, but we are also capable of choosing principles over survival." And he advanced to the next display. "And this makes us very dangerous in ways that your sensors cannot detect." The new images showed examples of human asymmetric warfare, from guerrilla tactics to terrorism to cyber attacks, and Hayek explained how humans had developed entire philosophies of fighting that were based on turning weakness into advantage, and how human military doctrine emphasized using whatever was available as a weapon, from kitchen knives to commercial aircraft to social media, platforms that could be weaponized to spread fear and confusion. "When humans cannot win through strength, we win through patience," said Hayek. "And when we cannot win through patience, we win through creativity." And his voice remained calm, but something in his tone made every being in the chamber feel a prickle of unease. "And when we cannot win through creativity, we simply refuse to lose, and we make the cost of victory so high that our enemies eventually decide it is not worth paying, Doctor. Mireille had been monitoring biological readings from the assembled representatives, and she noted with satisfaction that stress hormones and fear responses were spiking across multiple species as they began to realize that they had fundamentally misunderstood what they were dealing with. And up in the command booth, Kivri's mandibles were clicking rapidly as she cross-referenced human historical data against galactic warfare databases and finding patterns that terrified her. Your sensors detected no weapons when they scanned me, continued Hyuk, and they were correct because I carry no weapons in the traditional sense. And he gestured to his own body. But I am a weapon because every human is a weapon when necessary. And we can turn anything into a threat if we are sufficiently motivated. He described human improvised explosives and human social